This is my lecture for symbols and symbolism in my ENC 1102 classes. Once again, if you would just like to look at the notes without looking at the lecture or without listening to my voice, that is available to you. But this is just my lecture with not only the notes, but some of my further thoughts on the subject. So, what is a symbol? A symbol is a representation of something with a bigger meaning. A lot of stories have symbols and symbolism in them. Usually, if a story, this week, we're also discussing theme. Usually a symbol is connected to the story theme in some way. Now, in literature, a symbol can be a person, a place, or a thing that could suggest more than its literal meaning. Sometimes it can also be an action, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. But some examples of symbols would be, let's talk about the Telltale Heart. The Telltale Heart, even though it's definitely just a horror story, you could read some of the actions and objects in it as symbols. For example, the man, the killer in the Telltale Heart, really hates the old man's vulture eye. Now, this could be a symbol of the man hating being watched, like he's paranoid that he's being watched and being judged by this person he respects. So the eye could be seen as a symbol. Likewise, later on in the story, he places himself right over the body. This could be a symbolic action of him placing himself above the person that he killed. Like, not only literally, but in terms of, like, he feels he's superior to the person that he killed. Right? It's very important to understand that symbols are subjective. So, basically what I'm saying is, my interpretation of a symbol can be completely different from your interpretation, and they're both equally valid interpretations. It's like I've been saying all semester. Your opinion and my opinion are equally valid. Just because I'm a teacher doesn't make any interpretation of a work less valuable than my own. Yes, I have some experience in researching and understanding these stories, but that doesn't mean your opinion is any less valid than mine. So, an allegory is a vocabulary word. It's one of the vocabulary words you should definitely know for the test. An allegory is a story in which persons, places, and things form a system of clearly labeled equivalents. Basically, an allegory is a story filled with symbolism, and all the symbols are super obvious. For example, if you have a woman named Faith in your story, and it's an allegory, and she's kidnapped during it, it's a very obvious symbol of losing your religious faith. And that's a story we may or may not be reading later in the semester. Another story that has some symbolic meaning to it would be an allegory for it would be The Yellow Wallpaper, which is one of the stories you will be reading this week. Now, The Yellow Wallpaper has a woman who is being controlled by the men in her life, and she's trapped in a room. And you could say that this room is it's symbolic not only for her being trapped in a physical space, but also trapped in her mind. You'll notice that she will deteriorate mentally throughout the story. So she's trapped in her own head. Not only in her own room, but also in her own head. So that's kind of an allegory in itself. So let's talk about different types of symbols. The first, most obvious type of symbol is the object symbol. Now, one of the stories that you may be reading this week, thinking you will, is called The Necklace. And the necklace, which, just to give you a little bit of a spoiler warning, oops, I think I pressed something wrong there. The necklace in the necklace is symbolic of the woman herself, because it's an object that looks very rich, and she's pretending to be rich for one night, and then she loses the ability to pretend to be rich. She loses that necklace. So that could be a symbol for that. a particular action. Sometimes the story's setting can be symbolic of the story's meaning. For example, the barn in the Gospel according to Mark. They are literally isolated from the world, and because of this, they become isolated from each other. The main character in the Gospel according to Mark has to find a way to reconnect with the people around him. Now, that doesn't really work out for him, as we have another symbolic moment in that story and a symbolic action. A symbolic action is when a character does an action that symbolizes something very specific about the author's intentions. For example, in the Gospel according to Mark, when at the end they are viewing the main character as a savior figure, a Christ figure, and they literally take him out back to prepare him for crucifixion so that they can be saved from the hell that they find themselves in. So that could be a very blatant symbolic action. And you also have symbolic characters. Now, that could be Faith in Young Goodman Brown. I'm pretty sure Young Goodman Brown is not a story we'll be reading in this, but Young Goodman Brown is basically a man who is having a crisis of faith. He literally meets the devil, and the devil takes his wife, Faith. So the devil takes his religious faith as well. We'll talk. We may or may not talk about that in the future. I'm thinking not. Anyway, so you have a symbolic object, a symbolic setting, a symbolic character, or even a symbolic action. All of these can be symbols. But what's the purpose of a symbol? Why do symbols exist in a story? Well, very briefly, symbols exist in a story so that the reader can understand what the author is trying to say about their story in a more blatant way. Sometimes if a story doesn't have symbols, it's a little bit more difficult to figure out what the author is trying to say with their theme. Right? The message of the story might be unclear. Now, every single object, character, and place in a story isn't or shouldn't be symbolic. Otherwise, it might be confusing for a reader. For example, in The Telltale Heart, I could say that the old man's vulture eye is symbolic of being judged, and the guy sitting, could you shut up, phone? The guy sitting down next on top of the body could be a symbol, but the police coming in aren't necessarily a symbol, at least in my interpretation. Usually symbols are supposed to be especially emphasized in the story for some reason. For example, one of the stories you'll be reading this week is The Lottery. The lottery has one object in it, which is a black box that holds all the papers for the lottery in it. Now, again, this is sort of a spoiler warning, but the black box is symbolic of a coffin. It contains death for one person. Now, that's kind of an obvious symbol in my opinion, but this particular box definitely has emphasis on it in the story. Other objects are sometimes more subtle in the story and they need more analysis. For example, let's say the tomb or the ancient grave in the graveyard book could be a symbol. If you analyze it the right way, it could be a symbol. But again, symbols are kind of subjective. That's why I kind of leave this for the very last lesson for the semester, because this, out of everything we've talked about this semester, this particular lesson is full of subjective material. Something could be a symbol intended by the author. It could not be a symbol intended by the author. It's all up to reader interpretation. Alright, that's about it for this lesson. Hopefully you're all staying safe and sane out there, and please remember to wash your hands.